My name is Nate Sheridan, and I have been chasing storms for 17 years. I started when I was 17 years old, riding shotgun with my Uncle Roy in a beat-up Ford Bronco across the flatlands of central Kansas. Roy was one of the old-school chasers. No fancy radar apps, no live satellite feeds, just a weather radio, a road atlas, and 30 years of reading the sky like most people read a book. He taught me everything I know, and what he taught me most was respect. You respect the weather, or the weather will kill you. Simple as that. I am not a meteorologist. Never went to college for it. Everything I learned came from being out there, season after season, watching the sky do things that textbooks can only approximate. I drive a reinforced Chevy Silverado I call the rig. I have seen F4 tornadoes rip apart communities and sat with families in shelters while the world outside sounded like a freight train was being fed through a wood chipper. I have pulled people out of collapsed homes. I have watched grain silos get peeled apart like tin cans. I am not telling you this to brag. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that I am not someone who scares easily, and I am not someone who makes things up. Over 17 years of chasing, I have had 3 experiences I cannot explain. Not close calls, not equipment malfunctions. 3 times I encountered something during a storm that was not weather. I have never talked about them publicly because in my line of work, credibility is everything. If people think you are crazy, nobody listens when you tell them to get underground. But I am getting older, and I have been chasing less these last couple of seasons, and I think someone should hear these stories before I convince myself to keep them buried for good. 3 stories, chronological order, told as straight as I can manage. The first one happened about 5 years ago, early June, central Kansas, on a stretch of county road between the towns of Ellenwood and Hoisington. If you have never been out there, it is about as flat as the earth gets. Wheat fields running out to the horizon in every direction, a few grain elevators poking up in the distance like fingers. You can see weather coming from 50 miles away, which is exactly why chasers love that part of the state. No surprises. Everything is right there in front of you. I was tracking a line of supercells moving northeast. Conditions were textbook, high dew points, strong wind shear, a dry line punching east through the state. The cap had broken around 3 in the afternoon and storms were firing like clockwork. I was positioned on a gravel road with clear sight lines, parked on the shoulder with my windows down, watching one of the cells separate from the main line and start rotating on its own. The wall cloud was already forming. I could see the updraft base tightening, that dark bowl shape dropping lower and lower. Everything about it said tornado. I had seen this setup 100 times. I knew what was coming. I had maybe 10 or 15 minutes before it dropped a funnel. Then something happened that I had never experienced in over a decade of chasing. The sound stopped, not faded, not got quieter. Stopped, like someone had reached into the air and pulled the plug on everything. The wind noise was gone. The hail rattle that had been ticking against the far side of the truck was gone. The deep, continuous rumble of the storm, that growl you feel more in your chest than you hear with your ears, was gone. My truck was still running. I could see the tachometer moving, but I could not hear the engine. It was like the world had been put on mute. I sat there for a second, trying to make sense of it. I thought maybe my ears had popped, some kind of pressure thing. I swallowed hard a few times. Nothing changed. I snapped my fingers next to my ear and heard nothing. Then I looked back at the wall cloud, and that is when the fear hit me. It had stopped moving, not slowed down, stopped. The rotation that had been tightening and accelerating just seconds before was frozen. The updraft was locked in place, and the debris that had been circling inside the mesocyclone, pieces of what looked like sheet metal and tree branches caught up in the rotation hundreds of feet off the ground, was hanging motionless in the air, suspended, like someone had taken a photograph of a storm, and I was sitting inside it. I do not know how long I sat there staring. It felt like about 45 seconds, but I cannot be sure because time gets strange when your brain is trying to process something it has no category for. During that silence, I became aware of a pressure in my chest. Not pain, more like weight, like the air itself had gotten heavier, like gravity had increased just a little, just enough to notice. And then I saw movement. On the ground, directly beneath the frozen storm, something was crossing the wheat field. It was maybe a half-mile from me, hard to make out clearly because of the distance and the strange green light that storms throw when the sky gets that sick copper color. But I could see it moving through the wheat. Not a person, not an animal. The best I can describe it is a shadow, except it was not flat on the ground the way a shadow should be. It had depth, it had dimension, it moved with purpose, crossing the field in a straight line beneath the stalled storm, like it was going somewhere specific. Then everything snapped back. The sound returned all at once, not gradually, but like a door being thrown open. The wall cloud lurched back into rotation. The debris fell. I could hear my engine again, could hear the wind and the hail and that deep thunder growl. Within 2 minutes, the cell produced a tornado, an EF2 that cut a path for about 6 miles through empty farmland. I followed it and did my job. I called in the report, drove the damaged path, checked for injuries. Nobody was hurt. But I kept thinking about those 45 seconds. The silence, the frozen storm, the thing moving beneath it. I checked later with other chasers who were in the area. Nobody reported anything unusual, just a standard tornado from a standard supercell. Nothing worth mentioning. I did not sleep well for about 2 weeks after that. The second one happened roughly 2 years later. Oklahoma Panhandle, which for those who have not been there, is about as empty as America gets. It is a long, narrow strip of flat nothing that sticks out from the top of the state like a handle on a pan. Hardly anyone lives there. Hardly anyone drives through unless they are lost or chasing. I was out with another tracker I trusted, a guy named Cody Wills. Cody had been chasing almost as long as I had. He was solid, level-headed, not the type to get spooked by a close intercept or a bad road. We worked together well because neither of us felt the need to be a cowboy about it. We were tracking a storm that had developed fast in the late afternoon. Too fast, honestly. The conditions that day were marginal. Most chasers had written it off by noon. The atmosphere was capped, the shear was weak, and the moisture was barely adequate. Most of the guys I knew had stayed home or repositioned further east. But this cell exploded out of almost nothing around 4:30 in the afternoon and started showing strong rotation within 20 minutes of forming. It did not make sense meteorologically, but it was there, so we went after it. We were on a straight 2-lane highway with nothing around for miles. Brown grass, fence posts, a few cattle guards. The storm was to our west, moving northeast, and we had a perfect view of the full structure. From a distance, it looked like a textbook supercell, rotating updraft, crisp anvil spreading out to the northeast, rain freebase on the south side. Everything in the right place. But something about it bothered me, and I could not figure out what. I kept looking at it, trying to identify what was off. The best I can do, even now, is say that it looked like a storm, the way a mannequin looks like a person. All the parts were there. The shape was right, but something essential was missing. Something I could feel but not name. Cody noticed it too. He was in the passenger seat, watching through binoculars, and he lowered them and said the storm did not sound right. And he was correct. Storms have a voice. If you have spent enough time around them, you can read that voice like a language. The pitch of the wind tells you about rotation speed. The rhythm of the thunder tells you about lightning frequency. The low rumble tells you about the size of the hail. This storm sounded thin, distant, like the sound was coming from somewhere behind the cloud structure, rather than from the storm itself. Like someone had recorded a storm and was playing it back through speakers that were not quite loud enough. We pulled over about 2 miles from the base of the cell. That is when we noticed the smell. It was not ozone. It was not petrichor, that wet earth smell you get when rain hits dry ground. It was not the scent of freshly cut vegetation that strong winds pull out of fields. It was something organic, something alive. The closest comparison I can make is the musk you would catch downwind from a large herd of bison, that heavy animal smell. But it was wrong. Sweeter than it should have been. Thicker. It coated the back of your throat and sat there. Cody rolled up his window. I almost did the same, but I was still watching the storm, and that is when it started to pulse. Not flicker with lightning. Pulse. The entire cloud structure expanded and contracted just slightly, just enough to see if you were looking closely, like something breathing, and we could feel it. The air pressure pushed and pulled against our eardrums in rhythm with the movement, in and out, slow and steady like a heartbeat. Cody said we should leave. I agreed. There was nothing about this situation that I wanted to be a part of anymore. I put the truck in gear and started to turn around on the highway. That is when the storm collapsed. I do not mean it dissipated. Storms dissipate all the time. They weaken, they lose structure, the updraft dies, and they rain themselves out over the course of an hour or more. This was not that. The entire cell structure dropped in on itself like a building being demolished from the inside. The clouds folded inward and downward. The anvil collapsed. The wall cloud just ceased to exist. The whole thing crumbled into nothing in less than 30 seconds. One moment, there was a massive supercell dominating the western sky. The next moment, there was blue sky and sunshine. We sat there on the highway for a long time without saying anything. Eventually, we drove through the area where the storm had been. The ground was dry. No rain had fallen, no hail, nothing. The grass on either side of the highway was standing straight and untouched. There was zero evidence that a storm had ever been there. None, except for the smell. That animal musk lingered in the truck for 3 days. We tried everything: air fresheners, open windows on the highway, baking soda on the seats. It faded slowly on its own, like it was evaporating out of the upholstery at its own pace. Cody and I did not talk about what happened. Not that day, not the next week, not ever. He quit chasing the following year, moved to Colorado, and got into real estate. We still text sometimes about football scores and fishing. We do not mention the Oklahoma Panhandle. The third one is the most recent and the hardest for me to tell. It happened last spring in a small farming community in northwest Missouri called Garfield Crossing. Population somewhere around 300 people. The kind of place that has one gas station, one church, one grain elevator, and not much else. You would drive through it on a county highway and forget it 10 minutes later. I was tracking a large storm system moving through the region. Multiple cells, tornado warnings already issued for 2 counties. It was an active day, the kind where the Storm Prediction Center has half the Midwest painted in red, and chasers are scattered across 3 states trying to pick the right target. I had been on the road since early morning and my fuel gauge was getting low, so I pulled into Garfield Crossing to gas up and wait for the main line to get closer. The town was mostly shut down. Streets were empty. Everyone was either in their basements or had driven south to get out of the path. I found the gas station still open, a little 2-pump place with a hand-painted sign that just said fuel. The man running it was an older guy, maybe late 60s, lean and weathered the way farmers get. He told me his name was Lyle. I made conversation while I filled up, mentioned the storms coming in, asked if they had a shelter at the church or the school. Lyle gave me a look I did not quite understand at the time and said the storms always come to Garfield Crossing, but they never touch it. I assumed he meant the town had been geographically lucky. Some places are like that. A river valley or a ridgeline can deflect storms just enough to create a pocket that rarely gets hit. It is not magic, it is terrain. I nodded and said something about them being fortunate. Lyle did not correct me, but he also did not agree. He just looked past me toward the east side of town, out toward the open fields, with an expression I can only describe as resigned. Not scared, not anxious, just resigned. The way you look when you know something is coming and you have made peace with it a long time ago. I thanked him and drove over to the grain elevator at the east edge of town to watch the line approach. It was the highest ground in the area and gave me a clear view to the west and northwest where the storms were coming from. The sky was ugly. Multiple cells stacked up in a solid line. That kind of squall line that looks like a wall of dark blue and green pushing across the plains. I could see rotation in at least 2 of the cells. Lightning was almost continuous. Not individual bolts, but a constant flickering inside the cloud mass like a strobe light. The wind ahead of the line was picking up, pushing dust and loose straw across the road. Everything about it said this was going to be a rough passage. The line got within 5 miles, then 3. I could see the rain curtains dragging beneath the cells, could hear the continuous rumble building. I braced myself for the hit, and then the storm split around Garfield Crossing. I need to be very clear about what I mean because I know how it sounds. I have seen storm splits before. It happens when a supercell divides into a right mover and a left mover, usually because of wind shear interactions. It is a known meteorological event. This was not that. The entire squall line opened up. The cells to the north shifted north. The cells to the south shifted south. A gap appeared in the line that was exactly the width of the town. And I mean exactly. The storm walls on either side were close enough that I could have driven to them in 2 minutes. But directly over Garfield Crossing, the sky was oddly calm. Not clear, not sunny, but calm. The wind died. The pressure stabilized. Rain was falling in sheets a half-mile to the north and a half-mile to the south, but not a drop fell on the town, and the gap moved with the system. As the squall line pushed east, the opening tracked with it, staying centered over Garfield Crossing, like the town was sitting inside a bubble. I watched it happen in real time, and I felt something cold settle into my stomach because what I was seeing was not possible. Weather does not work that way. Weather does not make exceptions. Weather does not go around. Then I understood what Lyle had been watching for. Out in the field east of town, in that gap where the storm line was parted and the ground was exposed, while everything around it was buried in rain and darkness, something was standing. I could see it because of the contrast. The fields beyond the gap were black with storm shadow, and this thing was visible against that darkness. It was out there maybe a quarter mile from me, standing in the open between the crop rows. I struggle with this part because I have gone over it in my head hundreds of times, and I still cannot give you a clean description. It was tall, taller than it should have been, thin in a way that made me think of trees that have been dead for years, the ones that lose their bark and stand pale and bare in a field like bones sticking out of the ground. But it was not a tree. It was moving, swaying slowly from side to side, the way tall grass moves in a breeze, except there was no breeze inside the gap, just stillness. I could not get a clear fix on its shape. The light kept shifting as the storm walls moved on either side, throwing shadows and green flashes that made the edges of the thing shimmer and blur. But I am certain of two things. I am certain it was alive, and I am certain it was the reason the storms did not touch Garfield Crossing. It stood there for the entire time the squall line took to pass, maybe 15 minutes. I watched it from the truck with my hands on the steering wheel and my engine running, and I did not move. I do not think I was afraid in the way you are afraid of a tornado or a car accident. It was deeper than that, older. It was the kind of fear that does not make you want to run. It makes you want to be very still and very quiet and hope that whatever is out there is not interested in you. When the line passed and the sky opened up to the west, the thing was gone. The field was empty, just dirt and flattened crop from the rain that had fallen everywhere except on the town itself. I drove out to where it had been standing. There was nothing. Wet soil, bent stalks, no tracks, no marks, no indication that anything had stood in that spot. I went back to the gas station. Lyle was pulling down the awning over his pumps, the way you do at the end of a day. I walked up to him and I asked him straight. I said, "What was that in the field?" He looked at me for a long time. Not surprised, not defensive, more like he was deciding something. Then he said his grandfather had told him about it when he was young, said it had been there longer than the town, said the first settlers found it standing in the open prairie during a lightning storm in the 1870s, and they built Garfield Crossing right there on that spot because they understood that something protected that piece of ground. Lyle said nobody in town talks about it. Nobody has ever taken pictures. Nobody asks questions. They just live their lives and accept that the storms do not come to Garfield Crossing, and they try very hard not to think about why. I asked him what it was. He shook his head and said he did not know, and his grandfather did not know, and the settlers before that did not know either. Some things just are what they are, he said. You do not have to understand something to live alongside it. I drove back to Wichita that night. When I got home, I looked into Garfield Crossing's weather history. The town has never recorded a direct tornado strike, not once in over 140 years since its founding. Every town around it has been hit multiple times. Some of them have been hit so many times they have rebuilt their main streets 3 and 4 times over. Garfield Crossing has never taken a direct hit from anything worse than a moderate thunderstorm. I do not know what that means. I am just telling you what I found. I still chase, not as often as I used to. My knees are not what they were, and the long drives wear on me more than they did 10 years ago. But when the season fires up and the cap breaks and the sky starts turning that shade of green, I am still out there. I used to think storms were the most powerful thing in the world. I used to think that understanding them was a way of making sense of things, that if you could read the sky well enough, nothing could surprise you. I do not think that anymore. Now I wonder how many of the storms I have chased were real and how many were something else. Now I wonder what lives inside the weather, what has always lived inside the weather, and how long it has been using the sky to do whatever it is doing. The worst part is not the fear. I have been afraid plenty of times. Fear is part of the job. The worst part is the loneliness of knowing something that nobody wants to hear. Other chasers have seen things. I know they have. I have watched veteran trackers stare at a storm with an expression that does not match what the weather is doing. Not excitement, not caution, but something closer to recognition. Like they have seen this before. Like they know. Nobody talks about it. Everyone keeps chasing. You cannot exactly bring it up over beers without sounding like you have lost your mind. If you are ever driving through open country during storm season and you see a supercell building on the horizon, I want you to do something for me. Do not watch the tornado. Do not watch the hail. Watch the edges. Watch the ground beneath the storm. Watch the places where the weather chooses not to go, because those empty spaces are the real story, and the things that live in them are older and stranger than anything the sky has ever thrown at us. I do not expect anyone to believe me. I just needed someone to hear it, and now someone has.